I think that's a really important point. There's been a lot of discussion, and a lot of this discussion came surrounding earlier conversations about autism, from 10, 15, 20 years ago. Can you cure autism? Now, most people would say no, and I think they'd be probably right. But what are the features of some of the things that we see in neurodivergence? And are there ways for us to have more positive control over our behaviors, over our thoughts, over our actions? So I'll give a really basic example. A lot of people used to feel very uncomfortable about conversations like this. If a pediatrician were to say to, let's say, a family of a child that is on the autism spectrum, have you considered eliminating sugar? People might say, it's none of your business. What does that have to do with anything? And for most of, the modern era, we've been told to say, what do you mean? Like, why should I think about additives? Why should I think about food dyes? That's crazy. That's for the hippies. Well, it turns out science has caught up with what a lot of parents had started noticing, that symptoms vary depending on how much sugar a child is eating. Symptoms vary in some families. They've noticed symptoms vary depending on the amount of preservatives and like artificial sweeteners and artificial colors that are in food. Does this affect everyone the same way? Of course not. Are those things making people autistic? Of course not. But what we're talking about is there's a chemistry going on in the brain, in the entire nervous system, throughout the body, and symptoms and flare-ups, right, are in many cases dependent on the environment of the cell. And what the environment of the cell is determined by is what's going in. It can even be impacted by what's going on emotionally. Anyone who falls under the neurodivergent spectrum, have you ever noticed feeling more dysregulated when you're stressed? Feeling more dysregulated when things in the environment don't feel good? Feeling more dysregulated or out of sorts when someone that you love is suffering or when someone's passed away? That doesn't mean that it's making you more autistic or making you more ADHD. What it means is that your brain and your chemistry is processing everything that's going on and sending out signals to the best of its ability. And we do know that there's a genetic basis, and that's, part of the research of the last decades and decades. Is there one gene for autism? Of course not. Is there one gene for ADHD? No. But what we're learning is that there's so many components of metabolism. Metabolism doesn't just mean, am I eating protein, am I eating carbs? It means how the body is processing everything that's coming in, right? Emotional metabolism, psychological metabolism. All of these things are factors in symptoms of ADHD, of autism spectrum diagnoses. And there are certain things you're not going to see different symptoms in Down syndrome. But even for things like bipolar disorder, OCD, those things can spike. When you say, gosh, my OCD feels so bad this week, feels so intense this week, it feels so much this week, it's likely because of other things. It could be diet, it could be sleep, it could be other metabolic processes, it could be what you're seeing on Instagram or in the news.
It's so interesting to think about the environment that we're in and how that impacts us. So it's not simply we have a condition, we have a certain set of symptoms or ways of being, but how our entire lives, absolutely sleep, impact how we function. And that's true for people who are normies, and it's true especially for people who may have a difference in how they function.
So the next question, which is a little harder to answer, what's going on in the brain when we talk about neurodivergence? The answer is a lot of stuff, because think about the list that we talked about. If you ask me what's going on in the brain with neurodivergence, I'm going to say which part. Because if you ask me what's going on in the brain with autism, I can speak to that a little bit. If you ask me what's going on with ADHD, I can speak to that a little bit. It's going to be different than autism. There might be some overlap. Then if you're going to ask me about anxiety, that's also something different in the brain. What about sensory processing disorders? Also different in the brain. So this is like a little bit of spoiler alert. I can't tell you one thing that's going on in the brain for neurodivergence, because we need to know what kind of neurodivergence we're talking about. So the more specific we can get, the more interesting I think the conversation can become. It's beyond the scope of what we're going to cover here, but my hope is that we'll be able to cover the things that we haven't yet covered on episodes of our podcast, we'll be able to get to. So for example, we did an episode where we talked about empaths. We talked about sensory processing disorder, a little bit of the anatomy and some of the neurochemical implications. What I can say generally speaking about the brain is, all about detecting patterns and detecting meaning. And there are many structures in the brain, but the number of connections in the brain is what makes it brain. It's not just about this part of my brain works well, or I've got a really strong hippocampus. It's about what are the connections that we allow our brain to make, and what are the environments we place ourselves in to facilitate that. So, not a big surprise if you were to take a mind-expanding drug that is designed, right, to increase connectivity and certain kinds of experiences, you're going to get an increase in connectivity and certain kinds of experiences. But for people who are neurodivergent, they may already have certain things that open them up to seeing things in a totally different way. I recognize patterns that other people may not. I'll never forget, I was sitting with my friend Emu many years ago, Emu who started our YouTube channel years ago. And I was, mesmerized by the clouds. They happened to be moving very quickly. It was like one of those like chilly spring days in Manhattan. And I had to stop the conversation we were having to observe what was happening. And he looked up and he said, I don't think I would have noticed that before. It's just not how his brain, right, was wired to track. So what does that mean? It opens up possibilities for artistic expression, for also deeper feelings about things that other people may not notice. So these are all these kind of pathways that when people are very, very focused on rationality and numbers and logic, that's where the brain will often point towards, right? But once your brain is already sort of open to these other pathways, we're in many cases more likely then to act on them, to see them, and to find them in places that other people aren't finding them.
One of my favorite things about neurodivergent people is my ability to have multi-pronged conversations that do not follow any sort of linear pathway, but all lead to amazing outcome. Meaning, we can talk about something, pause that topic, go on a tangent. The tangent actually has relevance. And what I find is that they can see that multiple conversations happening at once are actually because there is an interconnected and relatedness to each of the topics. So especially as you're getting to know someone, if they're like trying to talk about your life story and hear more about how you grew up, it's often like, well, why did you move there? And in my life, like why I moved there is usually like 6 factors that all led to it. And there's my son and my job and what was I doing at the time. And then I had this apartment, and then like there's often their lives are not as seemingly straightforward as the people who we got together, we got married, we have kids, we've lived in the same house for X number of years. I think a lot of the non-normies end up having more complicated backstories, which I love exploring.
I like this theory. Neurodivergent people have more complicated backstories. I thought you were talking about the way you talk about your backstory, which I also think is a little bit neurospicy.
So yes, both of those are true, but I started with how we talk about our backstory, and then I realized the reason our backstories, we talk about it in a certain way is because they're a lot more complicated sometimes.
So this is, without poking too deeply here, I think this is an important point to make. Why might neurodivergent people have more complicated backstories? If we're looking under this umbrella, right? If we're looking under the umbrella, people who might have trouble writing, communicating what they want to say, understanding numbers, understanding abstract stuff, if that doesn't come as easy to you as it does for other people, a lot of basics in life can feel very challenging. A lot of basic things that you want to conquer can feel very challenging. The number of steps needed to do X, Y, or Z for people with ADHD can be crippling. It can be crippling. And I talked about this, my father of blessed memory, he hated filling out forms. And I just thought he hated filling out forms. And he was like against the man and the establishment and like, I don't need these forms and the government, blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't, blah, blah. My dad had trouble following a form. It was hard for him. And I didn't realize probably till after he passed away. He was the son of an accountant, and it was expected that he be perfect with numbers and precision. And why didn't he become an accountant like his father? And he's like, because I'm an artist, And so, but when I think about it, he was really good with certain aspects of numbers. He tried to major in math in college and then ended up switching majors to English. I think that there were things that he didn't have support for, but there was a certain way of thinking that he could not do, but it became his identity. I don't do that. But now I'm looking back and I'm thinking, gosh, what other things in his life were hard? What else was hard for him? And I think about the people that I know, and many of them do have complicated stories. Well, I couldn't figure this out. I couldn't get there, and I lost the thing. And yes, it is hard to be neurospicy.
One very common term with people who experience neurodivergence is the concept of masking, where they have to pretend that they either are a certain way, understand things that they don't, or present to the world in a way that the normies accept them as one of their own. And actually, for me, the most powerful experience I had was going to a school. You had to actually be some form of neurodivergent in order to go to the school. And it was the very first time that I didn't have to pretend. I didn't have to pretend I knew things that I didn't. I didn't have to pretend that I understood the assignment that was given in class. I could say, wait a second, I'm not sure when this is due or what's expected of me. And the level of relief that happened is so unbelievably powerful. It was a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying. And I think that's really what happens when people start to realize that they have these differences and start to connect with other people who have these differences, is that you can finally be yourself.
Well, and another thing that happens, and it creates a lot of tension. If you're a person who doesn't like when other people are chewing, that's misophonia, which I know is a Valerie thing. I think we can share that because she's shared it before. Masking means acting like you're fine when someone is chewing really loudly in your face. Like, that's masking. That's a thing you have to do. Another example that was given in one of these TikToks was creating symmetry around touch. I have to find very clever ways to complete symmetry that I need with touch. I also eat things in groups of threes. Now, a lot of these things are definitely, we're in the OCD land right now, comfortably resting there, almost like in a lounger in the pool in the OCD land. But one of those notions is like, my kids will tease me because they'd give me like 2 crackers and I'd be like, I need one more. And they'd be like, what if we don't give you one more? Like the lengths that I go to, and I even do it when I'm alone. Like, it has to be in threes, and I have to find ways to have symmetry around eating and around touch.
We have spent almost 6 years together, and I have not known that you're eating in threes. So you are masking so hard that I didn't even realize that.
Every time I'm taking your child's French fries right over your plate. Every time, yeah, it's 3.
I think that pattern recognition has a lot to do with how many neurodivergent people feel like they sense energy, where something shifts in the room or someone says something and you're like, there's more there. What could it be? I'm not saying it's only that. I do think that many neurodivergent people are sensing things that are beyond the 5 senses, but talk a little bit about the idea of pattern recognition and how it shows up.
I think there's a particular subset we're talking about of people who might be neurodivergent and interested in sort of tapping into those abilities in a spiritual or an energetic way. In that sense, I think that there's a lot of research that still has yet to be done. But I do think that in a lot of the conversations we've had, on this podcast about people who are more likely to be able to drop into, right, certain meditative states, certain, focus states, which, according to Suzanne Giesemann, you can teach yourself. Like, you don't have to naturally be that kind of person. But for people who are neurodivergent and might lean towards that kind of thing, yeah, I think that we might just say like, oh, that person's a really good reader of people, or historically that person would have been like the town matchmaker, right? Like, what is it like to be tuned into things that other people don't see? Patterns in behavior, patterns in consistency, even patterns in language that other people don't pick up on. I'm a very, very particular person. I do notice things other people don't notice. I can almost always tell when someone's had a haircut, even if they have very short hair. Like and people are always like, how did you notice? My own husband didn't notice, and it's like, I'm very observant, like that's part of this spectrum for me. This notion of pushing through and how much masking we do. And, I think about, I think about how many of us, when we were kids and we would complain to our parents or teachers, like something's not right. Like and we were just told everybody feels that way. You're fine. And that actually really gets my goat, when I express like a challenge and the other person so disproportionately tries to make me feel better by like making it universal. And it's like, no. And that's literally the three words: you don't understand.